Ah, oops, I have to center my head. What happened to the centering here? Sorry. Should I stop? Yeah, but it's off to the side. Yeah, well, hold on. Uh, all right. Right. Okay. Oops. A little bit bigger, maybe. Hold on. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. All right. So, all right, let's go. It says connecting. Okay. Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, this is Gregory Muna, aka Master Mu, and for today's edition of Art is the Church of God the Creator, where we say that with a smile, but we say it because we mean it. And we're returning to our final installment of the sort of ongoing seminar symposium on Aristotle's Poetics, and specifically the six elements of drama. So today we're going to look at the last two elements of drama, diction and thought. So we've looked at the previous four of the six elements of drama. And so we've looked at the first element, of course, plot, mythos. The second element, character or ethos. And then we've looked at a melody, melos, and spectacle, opsis, of the visual, audio, visual. And now we're looking at diction and thought. And we're going to summarize subsections 19 through 23 and then focus on sections 24 through 29. So, and the so I'm not going to repeat all of Aristotle's specific looking at the parts of speech, verbs, nouns, conjunctions, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to sort of summarize and then continue. And because a lot of this is also in Aristotle's rhetoric, so we don't need to go through all the rhetorical elements. And but just to summarize, Aristotle mentions in section 19 that dramatic incidents must be treated from the same point of view as the dramatic speeches, which is to evoke the sense of pity, fear, importance, or probability. So, and those are the key elements of catharsis: pity, fear, importance. Yeah. And he says the only difference is that these incidents should speak for themselves without verbal exposition, while the effects aimed at in speech should be produced by the speaker as in the results of the speech. So the modes of utterance. So letter, syllable, connecting word, noun, verb, inflection case, sentence, or phrase. So I'm not going to go through the definitions of the difference between sound, syllable, connecting words, and so on. We discussed this last time. So Aristotle's definition of sound, syllable, noun, verb, inflection, and their composites, simple, double, and so on. And words by current or proper words, Aristotle defines those as words which are in general use among a people versus strange words or unusual words. And let's mention again the idea of metaphor, which Aristotle defines as the application of an alien name by transference either from genus to species, from species to genus, from species to species, or by analogy or proportion. And once again, Aristotle mentions ornamental words, newly coined words, words which are lengthened by the changing of vowels, and so on. And then altered words in which the ordinary form is left unchanged, and then a brief description of the gender and noun, because Greece was a gendered language with masculine, feminine, and neuter. And okay, in section 22, Aristotle talks about style. And the key word here is that the key phrase for us to remember is the perfection of style is to be clear without being mean. And that the clearest style is that which uses only current or proper words. At the same time, it is mean. Okay, meaning simple. So to use a simple. So strange or rare words is that which differs from a normal idiom, yet a style composed of such words is either a riddle or a jargon. A riddle if it consists of metaphors, jargon if it consists of strange or rare words. I think this is relevant. What Aristotle is saying here about rare words is relevant to sound poetry, language poetry, and the modernism of Joyce, Pound, and perhaps, the early modernist poets, T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein. He says, for the essence of a riddle is to express true facts under impossible combinations. Now, this cannot be done by any arrangement of ordinary words, but by the use of metaphor it can. And he gives examples from poetry that he is familiar with, and he gives examples from Aeschylus and Euripides, and from the other tragedians. Okay, and he talks about the rhythmic effects of dithyrambs and so on. Of the various kinds of words, the compounds are best adapted to dithyrambs, rare words to heroic poetry, metaphors to iambic. Okay, once again, I'll repeat that. Dithyrambs, which were the poems of intoxication dedicated to Dionysus, rare words to heroic poetry, metaphors to the iambic, of course, iambic, short, long, da-da-da-da. In heroic poetry, indeed, all these varieties are serviceable, but in iambic verse, which reproduces as far as may be familiar speech, the most appropriate words are those which are found even in prose. Okay. And again, that Aristotle's sense of prosody, Greek prosody, is also concurs with the development of modern English prosody, in which the iambic verse, certainly since Shakespeare, has become predominant. From Shakespeare to Milton to the Romantics, the iambic, the iambic foot is the most familiar and most similar to the normal patterns of spoken English. These are current and proper, the metaphorical and the ornamental. And he concludes by saying, concerning tragedy and imitation by means of action, this may suffice. And I think we can perhaps resume our commentary, perhaps in section 23, and we can relate it to our other readings of Sophocles and Euripides, right? As to that poetic imitation which is narrative in form and employs a single meter, the plot manifestly ought, as in a tragedy, to be constructed on dramatic principles. It should have for its subject a single action, whole and complete, with a beginning, middle, and end. It will thus resemble a living organism in its unity and produce the pleasure proper to it. Okay. I think that's an interesting comment. He says here, the unity, grammatic unity, produces pleasure proper to it, like a single organism. That Aristotle's making a parallel between the fact that we are living organisms and that we have unity, physical unity, and that when we recognize the same sort of unity that we have as living organisms in art, that there is a pleasurable sense of recognition, of like recognizing like. This is what he means by the pleasure proper to it. It will differ in structure from historical compositions which out of necessity present not a single action but a single period, and all that happened in that single period to one person or to many, little connected together those events may be. So now he's talking about historical accounts, for example, Thucydides, right? And so he gives examples. For as the sea fight at Salamis and the battle of Carthaginians in Sicily took place at the same time, but did not tend to any one result, so in the sequence of events, one thing sometimes follows another, yet no single result is thereby produced. Such is the practice, we may say, of most poets. Here again, as has already been observed, the transcendentive excellence of Homer is manifest. He never attempts to make the whole war of Troy the subject of his poem, though the war had a beginning and an end. That would have been too vast a theme and not easily embraced in a single view. If again he had kept it within moderate limits, it must have been overcomplicated by the variety of incidents. As it is, he detaches a single portion and admits as episodes many events from the general story of the war, such as the catalogue of ship and others, thus diversifying the poem. All the other poets take a single hero, a single period, or an action of a single indeed, but with a multiplicity of parts. Thus did the author of the Kypria and the Little Iliad. For this reason, the Iliad and the Odyssey each furnish the subject of one tragedy at most two, while the Kypria supplies materials for many, and the Little Iliad for eight: the award of the arms, the Philoctetes, the Neoptolemus, the Euphues, the Mendicant Odysseus, the Laconian women, the fall of Ilium, and the departure of the fleet. The fall of Ilium, the departure of the fleet, these are treated in the Trojan Women of Euripides. So for those of you who we were discussing the significance of the Trojan women in terms of tragedy and of the narrative of the Trojan horse, and then the subsequent massacre and the fall of Troy. Okay. Looking now at section 24 of Aristotle's Poetics. Again, epic poetry must have as many kinds as tragedy. It must be simple or complex, or ethical or pathetic. The parts also, with the exception of song and spectacle, are the same, for it requires reversals of the situation, recognitions, and scenes of suffering. Moreover, the thoughts and diction must be artistic. For all these respects, Homer is our earliest and sufficient model. Commentary. Scenes of suffering. This is where Aristotle, of course, diverges from Plato in terms of the dialogues. And we can say that the creation of the dialogues was a way of avoiding scenes of suffering. Thucydides, of course, wrote a hypothetical dialogue known as the Melian dialogue, which looks at the suffering of the Melian people who were exterminated or attacked by the Athenians in 416 BC, and he creates a hypothetical dialogue between the Athenian generals and the Melian elders, and which has the famous saying, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Right, and that there can be no, bargaining unless people are of an equal stature. So the sort of notorious example of political realism or realpolitik or might makes right, which Euripides is then attacking morally in the Trojan Women, and which was also attacked by his contemporary Socrates, and for which Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, by attacking essentially that militaristic idea of overwhelming strength, right? And indeed, each of these poems, back to Aristotle, Poetics 24. Indeed, each of these poems has a twofold character. The Iliad is both once simple and pathetic, and the Odyssey complex, for recognition scenes run through it. At the same time, ethical. Moreover, in diction, the thought they are supreme. This is a question. What are the ethics of the Odyssey? The ethics of the Odyssey is that Odysseus is impeded in his telos, in his homecoming, because of his guilt in his complicity in the war crimes in the fall of Troy. So Odysseus is not simply a hero to be celebrated, but a complex character who must expiate his guilt before he can have a happy or an eudaimonia resolution of return to home in terms of the homecoming, the nostos, right? It's important not to have a simple-minded idea of Odysseus. Keep in mind that Dante places Odysseus in hell based upon the idea of Odysseus as the war criminal or as the intriguer of the Trojan horse and the murder of civilians in Troy. Back to Aristotle. Epic poetry differs from tragedy in the scale in which it is constructed and in its meter. As regards scalar length, as we have laid down an adequate limit, the beginning and the end must be capable of being brought within a single view. This condition must be satisfied by poems on a smaller scale than the old epics, answering in length to the group of tragedies presented at a single sitting approximately one or two, no more than 3 hours, right? Perhaps larger epic grand operas exceed that limit and go into 4 and 5 hours, but that seems to be an outer limit for a single sitting. And those are broken into acts with intermissions. I mean, we can say that there's a practical limit of about 2 hours to under 3 hours, certainly, for what can be considered a single sitting, in terms of what the human limit of what can be endured or focused on without a break. Okay. Epic poetry has, however, a special capacity for enlarging its dimensions, and we can see the reason. In tragedy, we cannot imitate several lines of action carried on at one at the same time. We must confine ourselves to the action on the stage and the part taken by the players. But in epic poetry, owing to the narrative form, many events simultaneously transacted can be presented, and these, if relevant to the subject, add mass and dignity to the poem. The epic here has the advantage, and one that conduces to grandeur of effect, to diverting the mind of the hearer and relieving the story with varying episodes, for sameness of incident soon produces satiety and makes tragedies fail on the stage if there's too much self-similarity. Yes. As for the meter, the heroic measure has proved its fitness by the test of experience. If a narrative poem in any other meter or in many meters were now composed, it would be found incongruous. He's talking of the dactylic hexameter, right? For of all measures, the heroic is the stateliest and most massive, and hence it most readily admits rare words and metaphors, which is another point in the narrative form of imitation stands alone. Shakespeare commentary here follows the example here in terms of inventive language. Of course, Shakespeare was famously inventive in terms of creating his own language to fit his heroic meters, right? On the other hand, the iambic and trochaic tetrameters are stirring measures, the latter being akin to dancing, the former expressive of action. The former, the iambic, and the latter, the trochaic, right? Still more absurd would be to mix together different meters, as was done by Cameron. Hence, no one has ever composed a poem on a great scale in anything other than heroic verse. Nature herself, as we said, teaches by the choice of proper measures. In modern English poetry, of course, the idea of the heroic couplet, of the 2 lines with the masculine rhyme, in the couplet in iambic pentameter, having a sense of heroic proclamation, or a sense of a positivist statement, a concluding idea, often the volta of the concluding idea of a speech or a soliloquy or the volta of a sonnet. I'm sure we will return to Shakespeare's sonnets and their interpretation through various critics such as Helen Wendler. Homer, admirable in all respects, has the special merit of being the only poet who rightly appreciates the part he should take himself. The poet should speak as little as possible in his own person, for it is not that which makes him an imitator. Other poets appear themselves upon the scene throughout, and imitate but little and rarely. Homer, after a few prefatory words, at once brings in a man or woman or another personage, none of them wanting in characteristic qualities, but each with a character of his own. Of course, there's the famous invocation of the muse, seeing muse of arms and the man, in which he's invoking specifically Achilles, right? And the wrath of Achilles. So that's a classic example, sort of the opening of the Iliad. The element of the wonderful is required in tragedy. The irrational on which the wonderful depends. Well, Homer breaks character only a few times in the Iliad, when the action becomes too overwhelming and sort of steps back for it, like the blood tide of the river Scamander and so on. But in general, Homer always speaks through his characters and hardly ever directly to the audience, right? That's also true of Virgil, but of course that antedates by several centuries the Poetics here of Aristotle. The element of the wonderful is required in tragedy. The irrational on which the wonderful depends for its chief defects has a wider scope in epic poetry, because there the person acting is not seen. Thus the pursuit of Hector would be ludicrous if placed upon the stage, the Greeks standing still and not joining the pursuit, and Achilles waving them back. All right, the pursuit and the murder of Hector, right? Which precedes the fall of Troy. But in epic poem, the absurdity passes unnoticed. Now the wonderful is pleasing. That's interesting. What Achilles says here is that the Achilles' murder of Hector is not, as described in the Iliad, would not be a suitable scene for dramatization. And that seems to be true as far as our, the history of that way of surviving Greek tragedies, right? Now, the wonderful is pleasing, as may be inferred from the fact that everyone tells a story with some addition of his own, knowing that his hearers like it. It is Homer who has chiefly taught other poets the art of telling lies skillfully. The secret of it lies in a fallacy for assuming that if one thing or another becomes a second, or it becomes, men can imagine that if the second is, the first likewise is or becomes. But this is a false inference. Hence, where the first thing is untrue, it is quite unnecessary, provided the second to be true, to add that to the first, or it has become. For the mind, knowing the second to be true, falsely infers the truth of the first. There is an example of this in the bath scene of the Odyssey. Okay, here Aristotle, I think, is subtly alluding to the teaching of Socrates, who basically taught his students that the Greek myths, the mythology of Homer, so were just all superstitious fables, and he was, according to most commentators, Socrates, a closet monotheist, in the sense that he denied the pantheon of the Olympians and so on, and just spoke of a unitary monotheistic principle of theos, the god, right? And this is really the legacy of the Pythagoras and the Neo-Pythagorean teachings of the Pythagorean school, the teaching of the one, how everything is part of the one. So there's a type of monotheism which is not that sort of intermediate point of Zeus monotheism, but just of a straight up theistic monotheism that's latent in Socrates' teaching, which also made him a subversive figure, a corrupter of youth in the eyes of in the panicked eyes of the Athenian democracy, but perhaps understandable given the dire state of military collapse in the Peloponnesian War, right? And the disaster of the Sicilian expedition. So we need to look at the death of Socrates and his conviction on the charge of corruption in historical context. Yeah. Perhaps his wife, Xanthippe, was more justified in her complaints than the misogynistic representation of her. Okay. Back to Aristotle 24, Poetics. Accordingly, the poet should prefer probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities. Okay, very important. The poet should prefer probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities. The tragic plot must not be composed of irrational parts. Everything irrational should, if possible, be excluded, or at all events, it should lie outside the action of the play. All right, and here's Aristotle's parenthetical commentary. As in the Oedipus, the hero's ignorance as to the manner of Laius's death, not within the drama. Very important. Okay, so even though Aristotle holds up Sophocles' Oedipus as an ideal drama, he points out that it's kind of ridiculous that Oedipus has no knowledge of the manner of Laius' death, that he's lived as the king here for 15 years, and he has never investigated it until now. That is not congruent with Oedipus' personality, or at least shows a very organized sort of conspiracy of silence around him that would have had to have been orchestrated by Jocasta and Creon and the others. Yeah. Okay, back to Aristotle, not within the drama. Or as in the Electra, the messenger's account of the Pythian Games. This is very important. Or as in the Mysians, the man who has come from Tegea and Mysia is still speechless. The plea that otherwise the plot would have been ruined is ridiculous. Such a plot should not, in the first instance, be constructed. But once the irrational has been introduced and an air of likelihood imparted to it, we must accept it in spite of the absurdity. Take even the irrational incidents in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is left on the shore of Ithaca. How intolerable even these would be apparent if the inferior poet were to treat the subject. As it is, the absurdity is veiled by the poetic charm which the poet invests in it. So we can think of irrational plot elements, this is my commentary, which are incorporated, but if they're presented probably, then we can accept them. The impregnable walls of Troy, and then the construction of the gigantic horse, all of this, this is perhaps an irrational plot point. Of course, mythologically, it's lampooned by Helen, making fun of the idea of the imitating the voices, calling out to the soldiers in the voices of their wives. That her famous ventriloquism, sort of points out it's kind of the improbability of the whole Trojan horse conceit. Likewise, we have to do some pretty fancy mental gymnastics to imagine that the arch problem solver, Riddler solver Oedipus has never thought about Laius' death in his whole 15-year reign. From his teenage to early adulthood. That does sort of beggars belief, But if it's presented logically, we can accept it. Back to Aristotle 24. The diction should be elaborated in the pauses of the action where there is no expression of character or thought. For conversely, character and thought are merely obscured by a diction that is over-brilliant. Again, using Aristotle's own terminology, the diction The lexis should be elaborated in the pauses of the action, of the plot, of the mythos, where there is no expression of character, that is to say, ethos, or thought, dianoia, thought, theme. For conversely, character, ethos, and thought, dianoia, are merely obscured by a diction, lexis, that is overly brilliant. Okay, so the lexis should not be the catchphrases. The language should not be more brilliant than the theme, the characters, or the plot, and that's very important. Otherwise, we can just quote phrases but then not care about the plot. We can think of modern examples. The brilliant dialogue of Tom Stoppard, who just died, may he rest in peace, the great British playwright Tom Stoppard, famous for his brilliant epigrammatic, funny dialogue in all of his plays, from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Vanity, all through, often overshadows questions of theme, plot, or character, for example. But no disrespect, not to speak negatively of the great playwright, and we will all miss and admire his legacy. Okay, back to Aristotle. But in the case of the greatest playwrights, Shakespeare, for example, or even in the middle ground, Oscar Wilde, the language, the brilliance of the language, it does not overshadow the plot. At least in the importance of being earnest, the lexis does not overshadow the characters of the plot. Perhaps in Wilde's lesser plays it does. Yeah, I'm of the minority opinion, which is that I consider Salome to be one of his great works, not a minor work. Okay. From Oscar Wilde back to Aristotle. Poetics 25. With respect to critical difficulties and their solutions, the number and nature of the sources from which they may be drawn may be thus exhibited. The poet, being an imitator, like a painter or any other artist, must of necessity imitate one of three objects. 1. Things as they were or are. 2. Things as they are said or thought to be. 3. Or things as they ought to be. The vehicle of expression is language, either current terms, or it may be rare words or metaphors. There are also many modifications of language, which we concede to the poets. Add to this that the standard of correctness is not the same in poetry and politics, any more than in poetry and any other art. Within the art of poetry itself, there are two kinds of faults: those which touch its essence and those which are accidental. If a poet has chosen to imitate something, but has imitated it incorrectly through want of capacity, the error is inherent in the poetry. Let's repeat that. If a poet has chosen to imitate something, but has imitated it incorrectly through want of capacity, the error is inherent in the poetry. But if the failure is due to a wrong choice, if he has represented a horse as throwing out both his legs off at once, or introduces technical inaccuracies in medicine, for example, or in any other art, the error is not essential to the poetry. These are the points of view from which we should consider and answer the objections raised by the critics. First, as to matters which concern the poet's own art. If he describes the impossible, he is guilty of an error, but the error may be justified if the end of the art is thereby attained, the end being thus already mentioned. So he's speaking of examples of logical impossibilities or of supernatural interventions. Okay, so as Aristotle says, if that is the effect of this or other part of the poem, is thus rendered more striking. A case in point is the pursuit of Hector. If, however, the end might have been as well or better attained without violating the special rules of the poetic art, the error is not justified. For what kind of error should, if possible, be avoided? In terms of the pursuit of Hector, again, Aristotle is saying that it's really impossible that the Greeks would have just stood back and not intervened in Achilles' attack and ultimate desecration of Hector, right? Okay. Again, does the error touch the essentials of the poetic art or some accident of it? For example, not to know that a hind has no horns is a less serious matter than to paint it inartistically. Further, if it be objected that the description is not true in fact, the poet may perhaps reply, but the objects are as they ought to be, just as Sophocles said when he drew men as they ought to be, Euripides as they are. In this way, the objection may be met. This is the classic sort of opposition of Sophocles and Euripides. Sophocles as representing ideal types and Euripides as presenting real types. Your mileage may vary. In this way, the objection may be met. If, however, the representation be of neither kind, the poet may answer, this is how men say the thing is. This applies to tales about the gods. It may very well be that these stories are not higher than fact, nor yet true to fact. They are very possibly what Xenophanes says of them. But anyhow, this is what is said. Again, a description may be no better than the fact. Still, it was the fact, as in the passage about the arms. Upright upon their butt ends stood the spears. This was the custom then, as it is now among the Illyrians. Again, in this passage, Aristotle basically refers to the Greek religion as just fairy tales. Yeah. He's referring to the stories of the gods as literature. He's taking Homer, the Homeric, and of course the Hesiod, the Theogony. He's taking all of this as poetry, as fiction, as literature, not as dogma, not as articles of faith. And again, that reflects the teachings of his teacher, Plato, and the teachings of his teacher's teacher, Socrates. Yeah. Again, in examining whether what has been said or done by someone is poetically right or not, we must look merely to the particular act or saying and ask whether it is poetically good or bad. We must also consider by whom it is said or done, to whom, when, by what means, or for what end. Whether, for instance, it is to secure a greater good or avert a greater evil. Other difficulties may be resolved by due regard to the use of language. And here we have some Greek spelling here, so please bear with me. We may note a rare word as in, I'll spell it out, omicron, upsilon, rho, eta, alpha, sigma, / mu, epsilon, nu, / pi, rho, omega, tau, omicron, nu, where the poet employs, again, I'll spell out in Greek, omicron, upsilon, rho, eta, alpha, sigma, not in the sense of mules, but of sentinels. So again, of Dolon, ill-favored indeed he was to look upon. This is not meant that his body was ill-shaped, but that his face was ugly, for the Cretans used the word epsilon, upsilon, epsilon, iota, delta, epsilon, sigma, well-favored, to denote a fair face. Again, zeta, omega, rho, omicron, tau, epsilon, rho, omicron, nu, / delta, epsilon, / kappa, epsilon, rho, alpha, iota, epsilon. Mix the drink livelier does not mean mix it stronger as for hard drinkers, but to mix it quicker. Sometimes an expression is metaphorical, as now all gods and men were sleeping through the night, while at the same time the poet says, often indeed as he turned his gaze to the Trojan plain, he marveled at the sound of flutes and pipes. All here is used metaphorically for many, all being a species of many. So in the verse, alone she hath no part, then omicron iota eta, alone is metaphorical, for the best known may be called the only one. Again, the solution may depend upon accent or breathing. Thus, Hippias of Thasos solved difficulties in the lines delta iota, delta omicron, mu epsilon nu, delta iota, delta omicron, mu epsilon nu, delta epsilon slash omicron iota, and tau omicron slash mu epsilon nu slash omicron upsilon, parens omicron upsilon, close parens kappa alpha tau alpha pi upsilon theta epsilon tau alpha iota slash omicron mu beta rho omega. Or again, the question may be solved by punctuation, as in Empedocles, of a sudden things became mortal before had learned to be immortal, and things unmixed before mixed. We should return to Empedocles and the pre-Socratics and their various visions, because, well, there's no understanding of classical philosophy without a thorough grounding in the pre-Socratics. Okay, especially, of course, Pythagoras, since I am a Pythagorean. Or again, well, I'm a heterodox Pythagorean in the sense that I believe that my materialist interpretation of Pythagoras is the correct one, and I believe that the Platonic immaterialist or so-called Platonic realist interpretation is incorrect. But, you know, I'm an anti-dualist. All right. I'm an anti-dualist, but I'm not a monist. All right, let's leave it at that. So we'll come back to Empedocles some other time. Or again, by ambiguity of meaning, as pi alpha rho omega chi eta kappa epsilon nu slash delta epsilon slash pi lambda epsilon omega slash nu epsilon chi, where the word pi lambda epsilon omega is ambiguous. Or by the use of language. Thus, any mixed drink is called omicron iota nu omicron sigma wine. Hence, Ganymede is said to pour wine to Zeus, though the gods do not drink wine. Of course, you know, they drink, you know, the ichor, or I mean the you know, ambrosia and so on. So too, workers in iron are called chi alpha lambda kappa epsilon alpha sigma, or workers in bronze. This, however, may also be taken as metaphor. We should just give a brief thought to the metaphor of Ganymede and Zeus and wine. No. So, you know, if this is meant essentially as a metaphor of illicit sexuality, Ganymede's wine pouring wine to Zeus, you know, is it implying that Zeus, under the influence of something that he should not drink, you know, or doesn't drink wine, is then connected to, you know, sexually or erotically to Ganymede? There's an interesting thing, of course, and of course, Ganymede is also the outsider from Ilium, you know, from Asia Minor, from Mount Ida, Troy, all of that. So all of that is poetically rife for, you know, interpretation. All right, but let's get back to Aristotle. Again, when a word seems to involve some inconsistency of meaning, we should consider how many senses it may bear in the particular passage. For example, there was stayed the spear of bronze. We should ask how many ways of this take being checked there. Commentary, Homeric scholars, of course, since Homer is describing a Bronze Age civilization, there are so many varieties of bronze, heroic bronzes, this bronze, that bronze, that bronze is kind of a universal signifier in Homer, in a way which perhaps was not clear in the post-Iron Age cultures, classical Greece and Rome and so on, bronze had a lot more poetic connotation in the Homeric universe than it did in subsequently. Okay. We should ask, back to Aristotle, we should ask in how many ways we may take a being checked there. The true mode of interpretation is the precise opposite of what Glaucon mentions. Critics, he says, jump at certain groundless conclusions. They pass adverse judgments and then proceed to reason on it, assuming that the poet has said whatever they happen to think, find a fault and think if it is inconsistent with their own fancy. They question about Icarius that has been treated in this fashion. The question about Icarus has been treated in this fashion. The critics imagine that he was Lacedaemonian. They think it strange, therefore, that Telemachus should not have met him when he went to Lacedaemon, to Sparta, right? But when the Cephallenian story may be perhaps the true one, they allege that Odysseus took a wife from among themselves and that her father was Acadius, not Icarius. It is merely a mistake, then, that gives plausibility to the objection. To commentary. To put this in more contemporary terms, what Aristotle is pointing out is presentism, how present-day commentators on Homer are always interpreting it through their present-day lenses and biases, and that they're looking at essentially a Bronze Age collapse narrative through an Iron Age empire mindset. But getting back to Aristotle. In general, the impossible must be justified by reference to artistic requirements, or to the higher reality, or to received opinion. With respect to the requirements of art, a probable impossibility is to be preferred to a thing improbable and yet possible. He refers, so that, again, this is an axiom of this whole section. In art, a probable impossibility is to be preferred to a thing improbable and yet possible. Again, it may be impossible that there should be such men as Zeus is painted. Yes, we say, but the impossible is the higher thing, for the ideal type must surpass the reality. To justify the irrational, we appeal to what is commonly said to be, in addition to which we urge that the irrational sometimes does not violate reason, just as it is probable that a thing may happen contrary to probability. Things that sound contradictory should be examined by the same rules as in dialectical refutation, whether the same thing is meant in the same relation, in the same sense. We should therefore solve the question by reference to what the poet says himself, or what is tacitly assumed by a person of intelligence. The element of the irrational, and similarly depravity of character, are justly censured when there is no inner necessity for introducing them. Such is the irrational element in the introduction of Aegeus by Euripides, and the badness of Menelaus in the Orestes. Thus, there are 5 sources from which critical objections are drawn. Things are censured either as impossible, or irrational, or morally hurtful, or contradictory, or contrary to artistic correctness. The answers should be sought under the 12 heads above mentioned. Okay, so in terms of a quick commentary here, in terms of what is rational and what is admissible, if there is an apparently, I think my interpretation of what Aristotle is saying in True Dramatics is that when we are dealing with like, for example, impossible or supernatural events on the stage, they should be presented in a way which can also be understood in secular terms, without resort to a crude deus ex machina. For example, in the Oedipus, the Apollo, the god Apollo, is constantly being addressed through apostrophes, as a figure. People are speaking to Apollo, or the statue of Apollo, the shrine of Apollo, and we are able to perceive it in purely secular terms, as ancient superstition. Even though the characters are, some of them are true believers in sort of the reality of Apollo the god. So, in terms of my own practice, I would proffer the axiom: anything worth stating can be stated in secular terms. I'll say that again. This is a personal statement of belief, which for me is congruent with what Aristotle is teaching here. Anything that can be stated, anything worth stating, anything worth stating can be stated in secular terms. If we by definition can only use theological or religious language for a statement, it is a bad faith statement. So anything worth stating, that is to say, a good faith statement, any good faith statement must be expressible in purely secular terms, regardless of its religious content. Yes. If you can only express it in religion, if it cannot be stated comprehensibly in non-religious terms, we must assume this to be a bad faith statement that is based upon deception and exploitation. Okay. The badness of Menelaus and the Orestes. Well, Menelaus is a bad character. I mean, he's from the Greek perspective, he is too dominated by his slavish devotion to Helen. Absolutely, yes. All right. I mean, his uxoriousness causes the death and destruction of countless thousands of people, right? Okay. And the murder of civilians in the Trojan War. Aristotle, Poetics, section 26. All right, we're coming up towards the very end now. In fact, this is the concluding concept here. All right, so Poetics 26. The question may be raised whether the epic or tragic mode of imitation is the higher. If the more refined art is the higher, and the more refined in every case is that which appeals to the better sort of audience, the art which imitates anything and everything is manifestly most unrefined. The audience is supposed to be too dull to comprehend unless something of their own is thrown in by the performers, who therefore indulge in restless movements. Bad flute players twist and twirl if they have to represent the coithro, or hustle the coryphaeus if they are to perform the Scylla. Tragedy, it is said, has the same defect. We may compare the opinion that the older actors entertained of their successors. Nemiscus used to call Callipyges ape on account of the extravagance of his action, and the same view was held of Pindarus. Tragic art, then, as a whole, stands to epic in the same relation as the younger to the elder actors. So we are told that epic poetry is addressed to a cultivated audience who do not need gesture, tragedy to an inferior public. Being then unrefined, it is evidently the lower of the two. Now, in the first place, this censure attaches not to the poetic, but to the histrionic art, for gesticulation may be equally overdone in epic recitation, as by Sosistratus, or in lyrical competition, as by Menestheus of the Opuntian. Next, all action is not to be condemned any more than all dancing, but only that of bad performers. Such was the fault found in Callipyges, and also of our own day, who are censured in representing degraded women. Again, tragedy, like epic poetry, produces its effect even without action. It reveals its power by mere reading. If then in all other respects it is superior, this fault, we say, is not inherent in it. Commentary. The argument that representing degraded women is subject for censure. I agree. I do not. I mean, I disapprove of the depiction of the degradation of women, either theatrically or in movies or anything like that. I find the scene of the attack and the degradation of Helen in the Trojan women of Euripides to be very disturbing. Is it gratuitous? Well, probably not, because Euripides is trying to show how abject people, in this case women, turn against each other in times of crisis instead of cooperating. And so that was his point. But it's still very upsetting to see on stage. And for that reason, perhaps people do not want to relate to it. And I can understand that, certainly. I find it upsetting. Yeah. All right, back to Aristotle's conclusion. And superior, so again, he's saying that if we can have just the deep effect of seeing tragedies by reading, then this is a superior. If the words just on the page have, this tremendous cathartic impact purely in and of themselves, without gesture, without music, then truly these are great words. And I'm sure we all have to agree with that, of reading, great epic poetry. The deep emotions that we experience in reading Homer, and Virgil, and Dante, and also in Milton. Yes. Okay. And superior, back to Aristotle, and superior it is, because it has all the epic elements. It may even use epic meter, and with the music and spectacular effects as important accessories. And these produce the most vivid of pleasures. Further, it has vividness of impression in reading as well as in representation. Moreover, the art attains its end within narrower limits, for the concentrated effort is more pleasurable than one which is spread over a long time and so diluted. Again, this is Aristotle praising the live performance of tragedy, as opposed to spending a long time reading an epic in print. What, for example, would be the effect of the Oedipus of Sophocles if it were cast into a form as long as the Iliad? Once more, the epic imitation has less unity, as is shown by this, that any epic poem will furnish subjects for several tragedies. Thus, if the story adopted by the poet has a strict unity, it must either be concisely told and appear truncated, or if it conform to the epic canon of length, it must seem weak and watery. Such length implies some loss of unity. If, the poem is constructed out of several actions, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have many such parts, each with a certain magnitude of its own, yet these poems are as perfect as possible in structure, each is, in the highest degree, attainable, an imitation of a single action. Again, unity is the criterion of artistic excellence here, and I think that is true in music, in art, in every conceivable art form. And why? Because of the unity of the human organism. Because you exist in one body, I exist in one body, we experience unity in every living moment breathing. Even though we are composed of millions of cells and billions of atoms and subatomic particles, we experience ourselves as unity because we are organisms, and this is what we instinctively seek out through our perceptions and visual, sonic, and so on, which are manifested on the highest level by art forms. And we've talked about overstuffed narrative, and how this confusion of epic and tragic, the conflict between the overstuffed narrative of epic versus the single narrative of tragedy, how it has destroyed many operas, by having too many events going on. We can look at the classic example would be Berlioz's The Trojans. Berlioz's attempt to get the whole Trojan epic into one tragedy, is extremely problematic. And on a lower level of ambition, more recent epic themes such as The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which was essentially an epic narrative, but which was not suitable for a single dramatic. It lacked the unity of a single dramatic telling. We discussed that previously. We'll probably come back to that. So too many events means we cannot experience catharsis. There's too many balls in the air. We cannot put enough identification with the catastrophe of the single protagonist and the antagonist to experience the the cathartic positive effects of the negative emotions of pity and fear. And I think that's Aristotle's main point here. All right, getting back to Aristotle's conclusion. If then tragedy is superior to epic poetry in all these respects, and moreover fulfills its specific function better as an art, for each art ought to produce not any chance pleasure, but the pleasure proper to it, as already stated, it plainly follows that tragedy is the higher art as attaining its end more perfectly. Okay, and this is one of Aristotle's most controversial assertions, that he rates drama, which was a new art form of the 5th century BC, as a higher artistic achievement than the older epics, the Homeric epics of like the 8th century BC. You know, so he's making, and this would have been quite logically rejected by the more conservative philosophers of his times, who viewed tragedy as trashy, as a kind of a trashy popular entertainment. And that was the viewpoint of his teacher, Plato, and this led to the rupture between Aristotle and Plato. Of course, I mean, he didn't establish his own school until the death of Plato, but he had been moving in a contrary direction for many years before the death of Plato. They could not agree to disagree on. Plato had his own disagreements, obviously, with the epic poetry, but still considered it to be better than tragedy. Aristotle considers tragedy to be ultimately, in its highest achievement, better than epic poetry. Plato substituted the idea of the dialogue for both, obviously, but we can talk about the dialogue some other time. Thus, all right, back to Aristotle's conclusion. Thus, much may suffice concerning tragic and epic poetry in general. There are several kinds and parts, with a number of each in their differences, the causes that make a poem good or bad, the objections of the critics, and the answers to these objections. Okay, so that is the end of our symposium on thought and diction in Aristotle's Poetics. And that'll be it for this cycle. I think we'll be next week. We're looking at Aristotelian poetics in the work of Samuel Beckett, who is on Broadway and waiting for Godot and Endgame and I believe Krapp's Last Tape. So we will look at some contemporary representations of poetic elements of poetry, fiction, and drama, and the work of the great 20th century master, one of my all-time favorites, Samuel Beckett. Until next week, I think it'll be a busy weekend, so we'll probably jump ahead of schedule. Maybe we'll probably add another update, perhaps the end of this week, Thursday or Friday, because Saturday and Sunday are going to be pretty busy. So until then, this is Gregory Muna, aka Master Moo, saying, wishing you a great week and reminding us all that art is the church of God the Creator. See you soon.